Hello, YouTube. The Tula Tokarev pistol was created back in 1933. Despite its impressive age, this type of weapon is on the market and still in use today in Russia, although it has long been losing to modern pistols in a large number of measurements. However, this has never stopped criminals. So why exactly did TT, abbreviated in Russian for Tula Tokarev pistol, gained such a halo of gloomy criminal fame in the wild 1990s, as the period is known in Russia? The Tula Tokarev became the first Soviet self-loading army pistol. It was constructed, so to say, back in 1930, and then the first of them was manufactured in 1933. The creator of the weapon was the famous designer Fyodor Vasilievich Tokarev. At one time, the TT was intended primarily to replace the nagant revolvers in the army, which were already in large numbers or were frankly outdated at that time. The pistol used the then popular 7.63 by 25 millimeter Mauser cartridge. Due to its simplicity and reliability, it earned a good reputation in the Red Army. Although, of course, TT had many drawbacks, it is enough to recall its terrible ergonomics. After the rearmament of the Red Army, TT got into the secret police arsenal, the NKVD, as the KGB was known at the time. Even before the war, Soviet criminals nicknamed the new weapon the garbage pistol. However, despite this, the gun immediately leaked into criminal circles, where it became very popular. Why is this so? Well, first of all, criminals are generally extremely picky about weapons and use everything they can get. Moreover, bandits do not go to the store for pistols, but as a rule steal them, or they buy weapons on the black market, where they mostly come from the same thieves, robbers, or corrupt police and army officials. By the way, during my youth in the Soviet Ukraine, I lived in what can be called as a tough neighborhood, and some of my schoolmates had fathers who worked at the local shipbuilding plant. And very carefully, when nobody could see it except most trusted friends, they built handguns for the criminals and sold them. I saw one or two of such weapons. Secondly, despite a number of disadvantages, the TT pistol was modern and pretentious and very powerful for its time, which, given a choice, of course, made it necessary to give preference in its direction. Moreover, its high kill rate and ease of maintenance allowed the TT to remain a fully relevant weapon until the ill-fated 1990s. And considering that for most criminal squabbles, so to say, anything that shoots would do, the TT is almost an ideal choice. Thirdly, a huge amount of TT was produced, and we'll get to it. And worst of all, a large number of the pistols were lost during the Second World War. First of all, for such a simple and ordinary reason as the death of its owner in battle. Subsequently, all these weapons fell into the hands of the population, who simply found pistols, and not only, over the next 60 years. Again, I will confirm that, because in the hills of the Podol neighborhood of Kiev, even in the 1960s and early 1970s, firearms from the war were found, including, unfortunately, those that blow up. A minor contribution to the saturation of the criminal arms market was made by the so-called black archaeologists, as the grave robbers were called, and still are called in Russia. They found, while digging for treasures, plenty of weapons buried through the land. The wild 1990s were remembered by the citizens of the former USSR primarily for the monstrous rampage of crime. It is unlikely that it will be a revelation to anyone in Russia that the bandits actively used firearms in their fights. However, again, where did it all come from? It is logical to assume that the criminal arsenal had mainly domestic roots, as described by me above. But in fact, this is not entirely true. After the collapse of the USSR, most of the illegal guns entered the country from abroad. According to the recollections of the investigators from the criminal police who served during the wild 1990s, the bulk of the weapons used by the bandits were army models in one way or another. As a rule, weapons were imported to Russia from the former Soviet republics and the countries of the collapsed Warsaw Pact. Similarly, weapons from Russia were sold to other republics of the former USSR. In this regard, very specific weapons sometimes turned out to be in the hands of criminals, including even the RPG-18 Muha rocket-propelled grenades. There was also outright exotic weaponry that penetrated the country, including from abroad. For example, the police occasionally came across the American Smith & Wesson bodyguard. The second most popular source of weapons were private, concealed workshops. And yet, despite all sorts of rarities, the main arsenal of gangsters was well known to the most Soviet citizens. It's not that hard to get a hunting rifle. However, from the point of view of crime, such weapons had one huge disadvantage: size. The conclusion is self-evident. So, in some regions of criminal Russia in the 1990s, it was the sawn-off shotguns of an ordinary hunting smoothbore rifle that was the most popular option for bandit weapons, obrez in Russian. The number of sawn-off shotguns seized per year was often 2-3 times higher than the number of TT pistols seized. At the same time, hunting rifles themselves were also used by bandits, although in noticeably smaller numbers. The second most popular weapon of gangsters in most regions was the old Tula Tokarev. I don't want to say reliable, but that's what they used. Russian crime loved this gun for its deadly power, simplicity, and cheapness. Hired killers also did not shy away from using TT, treating weapons as consumables. It was not a pity to throw the Tokarev away, and it was not expensive. It is noteworthy that approximately 2/3 of the seized firearms in the 1990s were not domestic, but Chinese-made, the so-called Type 44. Now, knockoffs, basically, if you think about it. The PM, or Pistolet Makarova, is the second most popular pistol among gangsters. For obvious reasons, the created serve and protect weapon could not help but end up in the hands of the bandits, meaning it was made for the police, but they didn't hold on to it. Although the main source of weapons for criminals was still the black market with goods from army reserves, specific weapons were often taken from murdered policemen. At the same time, relative to the same TT, the Makarov pistols fell into the hands of law enforcement officers about twice as often. The third most popular bandit pistol in the 1990s was the domestic small-size self-loading pistol developed in 1972, and I talked about it in some other videos of mine. But this Izhevsk factory weapon is not well known among citizens, as it was created at one time for the operational groups of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the KGB of the Soviet Union, like Spetsnaz, for example. The pistol, chambered for 5.45 by 18 millimeters, penetrated into the criminal circles of Russia, mainly from the former Soviet Union, where a gloomy chain of local armed conflicts stretched into the wild 1990s. The Stechkin automatic pistols, APS, chambered for the 9 by 18 millimeters, also fell into the hands of the police, including the silent version of this weapon, the silent automatic pistol, APB. Like the MSM, the APS, and the APB, which were mainly used by special forces, meaning Spetsnaz, entered Russia mainly from the territory of the former USSR, including from various so-called hotspots. At the same time, PSM was an exotic among PM and TT, while APS were a kind of exotic among exotics. But while the revolvers were widely used in the 1990s, contrary to the popular stereotype, they were not so popular. Although law enforcement officers still came across in numbers very different from a plain zero, meaning enough of the revolvers were netted by the police. Still, it turned out to be easier for bandits to get some kind of Chinese Type 54 than a revolver. And those revolvers still remember the Russian Civil War, so to say, and World War II. At the same time, a significant part of the seized revolvers were equipped with silencers, as a rule handmade ones or alterations. Of course, the showdown in criminal circles was not complete without automatic weapons. Predictably, the most popular option was the Kalashnikov assault rifle. Well, among Soviet-made long-barreled AKM and AK-74 weapons, they were the most popular options. Although there were not many submachine guns relative to the total mass of criminal barrels, so to say, referring to firearms. Quite naturally, pistols, shotguns, and sawn-off shotguns remained the main weapons of the bandits. It is worth mentioning separately that in 1990s, homemade weapons were widely used by criminals. Weapons converted from traumatic and gas weapons and the so-called forged weapons of the Second World War were also used to a limited extent. However, there were actually not many barrels, meaning firearms, imported from the territory of the former USSR and the Warsaw Pact. There were noticeably more handmade ones of the kinds in the 1990s that openly imported weapons from abroad. As for the TT, yes, the weapon in 1990s was really popular. To begin with, let's briefly look at the characteristics of the pistol. So the official years of production were 1930 through 1953. Weight, it was 0.854 kilograms without cartridge and 0.94 loaded. Length, 195 millimeters. Barrel length, 116. Cartridge was 7.62 by 25 from TT caliber, 7.62 millimeters. Principle of operation, recoil during short barrel stroke, barrel skew. Aiming range was 50 meters. Maximum range, it says in the records that I have, 2,289 millimeters, meaning bullet flight. Type of ammunition, 8-round magazine. Usually when talking about TT as a weapon for bandits, the compactness of the weapon is noted and the rather flat shape, which allowed it to be carried covertly. Accessibility is also an important factor and therefore cheapness. TT was taken out of military warehouses, found on battlefields, like I said, and other ways. Although they were discontinued in 1953, 1,740,000 were made in the USSR. It's the same story with ammunition. There were also a lot of it produced and it was easy to get them. Moreover, the 7.62 by 25 TT cartridge was also used in all Soviet submachine guns during World War II. And as a result, there were a lot of bullets. If we're talking about the cartridge, we can't help but recall its power. There were still legends that TT can penetrate any bulletproof vest as well as the rail and frontal armor of the Royal Tiger tank, so to say. These are stories, of course, but they are based on the real fact that the TT cartridge is one of the most powerful in its class in the world. In many ways, after the war, such power turned out to be excessive. The ammunition of the PM pistol, Makarova pistol, was developed. But we're talking about the use of the TT in the 1990s, so this power was very much for the needs of the bandits. In reality, the gun did not pierce the rail, but any car could be pierced right through. But there is another reason for TT popularity in the 1990s in certain circles, so to say. There's a story of a man who once bought a pistol in a factory box, and I don't think many people, even military people, have seen a pistol in its original packaging. So the second barrel came with the pistol from the factory. from the factory. When the first one was worn out, it was easy to replace it. But from the point of view of a ballistics experts, it's a different barrel in a pistol, which is essentially a different weapon. Actually, that's what they did in the 1990s. They didn't change the whole gun, they just changed the barrel. So that's what I wanted to let you know about these firearms today, and I'll bring you more stories about the pistols, submachine guns, and other weapons of the former USSR, modern Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Central Asia, and other former Soviet lands. So if you like my research, please kindly support me through the links you'll find in the description to this video. Look up my other videos about various weapons, you'll find them. Please subscribe to my channel. Please make sure they notify you when new videos come. And thank you for your attention to my work.